So I guess I'm here to give a slightly different presentation than some of what you might have been hearing. A lot of presentations at conferences are about tech or about, how do you do stuff with code or Kubernetes or whatever. I'm with Linux Professional Institute. The only code I write is bad, and so they keep me away from that stuff. But I'm reasonably good at documentation, writing, and that kind of thing, and so that's where they put me. But what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about things that go beyond tech. So for those that may not know, LPI is a global certification body. I helped co-found it in 1999, and we help people get jobs in open source. Our certifications and our exams are recognized worldwide. There is literally 193 countries and territories where there is at least one person with our certification. But if you're trying to get a job in North Korea, you're out of luck with us. And so we've been doing very well at this. We've been very well respected globally, and our certifications are really good at proving that people have technical skills. So our exams are in sysadmin and BSD and DevOps and stuff like that. But I want to talk about something a little bit different. So LPI is an organization. We have a middle word in our name, and that's professional. And so that means there's more to being a professional than just knowing how to code. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time today talking about the non-coding things of what makes you valuable in the workplace, what makes you valuable as an entrepreneur. And it's just been our experience that this is sort of a side that's lacking, that people are better at talking to their computers than they are talking to other people. And so we are now pursuing more along the lines of, okay, we've done certifications that test your skills at working with the tech. What can you do to advance the state of people's ability to get jobs, of people's ability to create new businesses and entrepreneurship, and basically grow open source beyond simply the tech smarts? And so we've been spending a lot of time thinking about this concept. What is an open source professional? And so we've already got the first part licked, skilled as in dealing with computers. That part you can do tests, can you do bash, can you do systemd, can you program, so on and so forth. How well do you know Git? That part we're basically doing okay at. But now the part about social, how do you deal with the community? And the ethical part about how do you deal with clients and with employers. And some of this gets very sensitive. Right now, I'm president of the Toronto Linux User Group. We've been around since the mid-90s. And one of the people in our organization is a kernel developer with a very long Indian-sounding last name. And he has taken abuse randomly from people on mailing lists and so on who has nothing to do with the quality of his code. Somebody took a look at his name, never having met him, never having spoken to him in person, but basically just on a name and an email address, being abusive. And he was genuinely wondering, what do I do? Where do I go? And there was no mechanism within the particular community he was in for dealing with that. And we took a look at that, and at least to me, that constitutes a problem that is going to affect the open source community as we go forward. Having good quality code is only part of the problem. Dealing with some of these issues, I think, is going to take up a good chunk of time going forward, especially as we go from the original generation of leaders that came along in the 90s and aughts. They're now starting to get old, to get tired, to get employed by other things and leave projects. What happens? What happens to their community? And also now people that come out of this program that are working with open source, okay, everyone's saying you can make money with open source. But if you can't talk to a client properly, that isn't going to be much help. So This part of the presentation I can go through very quickly because I think I'm kind of preaching to the converted. But this is the way I would talk about open source in a manner that isn't just a technical thing. That when talking about open source to people that don't know about it, you basically can say, this is good for the person who's coming into open source. It's good for their career because right now there's a lot of jobs working in open source. And it's good for projects. So tackling this at a very non-technical, practical level, it's still possible to make the case of why get involved in open source. And then you start to get into the free software versus open source stuff. I think there's lots of room for everybody in this. And I don't think anything we're doing actually runs counter to people that are promoting free software and want to call it that. But it's more than just the coding. It's more than just having quality stuff. It's more than just putting in commits and so on. And so understanding licenses is something that maybe some people spend effort on, but not a lot of people do. Everyone knows about the GPL, and most people know about the BSD license, but there's an awful lot of others. Hands up everyone who's heard of the Open Source Initiative, OSI. Okay, some, not everybody. OSI is essentially the keeper of quote-unquote open source. And so at the website of the Open Source Initiative, they maintain a list of licenses, and there's hundreds of them, starting with the BSD license and the GPL, and of course, if you want to go to the real heart of it, public domain. You can toss stuff out into the public domain, say, I decry all rights, and you can do whatever you want to it. And then everything becomes more restrictive after that. And you have different organizations that have different things they want to get out of a project, and that's how they choose a license. But if you're involved in a project yourself, or you want to start one, how you determine what license you're going to use is going to determine the kind of community you build, the kind of audience for your project, and the code that you produce is going to develop. And so then there's business models. And by that, I mean, how are you going to make money from open source? Are you going to just use like a Red Hat model and say, the code is free, but the branding and the service and so on is not? Or are there other models? There's a number of different ones that are out there. And so if you're working on a project in which you have some sway or you want to start one, this is the kind of thing that matters. Just saying BSD or GPL in itself will either gain or repel various people, both coders and users, depending on who you're trying to attract. And so you have hybrid dual license models where you can say, okay, this part of the code is open source, but we put on a few little features here and there, and if you want that you're going to pay for, that's proprietary. Totally acceptable. I mean, to somebody who wants 100% free and open source software, it's not good. But if you want to pay your rent, for some instances, that's going to work. But there's a number of different approaches. All I'm trying to do right now is to get you to think about there's more than one approach to this. There's more than one way to make money selling your services or training or anything else to do with open source. I mean, now you're out there just being employed as a coder. For some people, is going to be their whole life, and that's great. Some people spend their entire life as an admin. That's fine. Some people want to create businesses and to do innovative things with this stuff or create new projects. And it's important just to think ahead of time about how this is going to work. And of course, for somebody that's just getting involved, get a GitLab account, start contributing, start to see the kind of feedback, and get a feel for the kind of communities that you want to be a part of. And of course, they're not all the same. They're going to, in many ways, take on the character of the people that have either founded it or running the community. And so the term co-opetition was coined by Ray Noorder, the guy that invented Novell, which for 30 seconds, I think, owned a Linux distribution. Sorry? Yes. And in fact, I was there the first year that the first brain share in Salt Lake City, where Novell had invited a whole team from Nuremberg to come over, and they were searching the streets for a decent beer. This was pre-Olympics, when you had to get a membership to join a bar just to get 3% Bud. And you have these guys coming from the Bavarian purity laws saying, where can I find something? Utah was not the place for them. So it was very awkward. And I seem to remember once upon a time that the Sousa head office in Nuremberg, it's sort of like there was the line, and there was the red side and the green side. And they barely talked to each other, but that's a different story. But, Novell arguably played an interesting part in the very beginnings of open source. But what they did contribute was the concept of co-opetition. And co-opetition in some cases is very fundamental to some of the models of open source, where you can have a whole bunch of companies, defense contractors, construction companies or whatever, that normally despise each other, but realize that it's in their common interest to have an architecture that they can all build on. And the architecture is common, but their value add is not and proprietary. So there's many different collaboration models, and I'll point to sort of the Bible of this at the end of my talk. But sometimes, things are going to happen. Can anyone think of the F word that I'm thinking of here? Okay? Not that one. Forking. Right? Almost that one. Okay? Important distinction. But to many people I've heard, forking is open source's F word. Somebody gets tired of a project, thinks, I can do better, and they'll go off and they'll splinter the community, and you'll have half the good people here and half the good people there. And some are very high profile, like OpenOffice, LibreOffice, and some are not so high profile. But also, this is all have to do with, in some cases, getting along. Now, you can have irreconcilable differences, like some people just couldn't get along with Oracle. But for a lot of smaller projects, if there was just a little bit of social skills and a little bit of slack being given, you might not have quite as much fragmentation as you do. And so I used LibreOffice and MariaDB as two very high-profile examples of forking in the community. And they forked basically because of the participation of Oracle, which bought Sun and then bought MySQL, and the developers just wanted nothing to do with it. But there are lots of reasons why people will fork their projects, and most of them aren't good ones. They have to do with personalities as opposed to code quality. And so, if people just sort of slowed down, cut a little slack, we could keep these projects together rather than splintered. And so this is why we got into things such as the ethics of open source. And at the very beginning, people just didn't think much about it. Open source itself is ethical. It's a great thing to do. It's good for society. It's good for the world. But there's more to it than that. And that's why I talk about diversity, because it goes back to the experience I had with my friend in the Toronto kernel community who got basically bullied out. He was a very, very good coder. He was paid by a Fortune 500 company to be in the kernel, and it got to the point where he just couldn't tolerate being there. And that was their loss. And at least I, and through LPI, we want to try and do what we can do to try and calm that down a bit and slow that down. And some of this is the same kind of conversation that's having in society as a whole, but it shows up a lot in open source, where you don't have an employee that you can control. You have volunteers and participants in a mailing list who are collaborating on a project and have to depend on each other. So there's a dynamic here that's a little different from you have a bunch of employees in a shop that are coding according to what their manager wants them to do. Here, if you're a volunteer, if you don't like what's going on, you walk. And so it's important to try and make sure that people don't walk. And that's why I'm saying, it may sound obvious, but I've come across enough instances where people just feel unwelcome where they are. And I don't mean snowflakes and that kind of thing. I mean people that are into a project to try and deliver good code. Most of the complaints that I've heard have come from women that just, again, based on names on email addresses and things like that. There was a couple of years ago, I was into content management systems for a while, and the same year I went to, there was a DrupalCon in Toronto, and there was a WordPress conference in Toronto. And the audiences were staggeringly different. The WordPress conference was about 50-50 male-female. The Drupal conference was, I think, something like 10% women. And it's not like one system was inherently superior to the other. They both performed their role in the community. But why is that? Why did one community have a really good balance and one didn't? And I don't know if I have an answer to that, but it's worth thinking about. If you're involved in an open source project, think about whether you're attracting the best talent you can, because you're not attracting people with money. You're attracting them with goodwill and the feeling that you're contributing to something useful. And so there's that. And then I also want to think about the ethics and talk about the not quite open. So I'll use two examples. One is called open core. So it's one thing to say you have an open source base for something that allows other companies to put on proprietary value add. In the world of open core, and there's an actual, I believe, open core consortium or whatever, where that gets really tightened, whereas the free and open source stuff is a real tiny part of it, but to do anything useful, you need to get the proprietary add-ons, and that's not, well, to me, that's not good. That's not really honoring the spirit of doing this in an open source way. And it's important when getting into a project, knowing what that is. And then there's another component to this that on one side seems really ethical, but also goes against what both open source and free software is. Anyone here aware of the ethical source movement or licenses? You have a category of people that says, I want to do open source, I want to put my software out in the world, but you can't use it if you're one of the companies that was just talked about in the keynote. Can't be used for military, can't be used for in various countries whose human rights I don't like. And so there's a concept of open source that allows the authors to determine the use, who can use it. Anyone can code for it, but only, peaceful companies or whatever can use it. The problem is that goes against both the open source definition and Freedom Zero as defined by the Free Software Foundation. Free Software Foundation says Freedom Zero, you cannot restrict use, period. You must have the stuff that's out there available for use by anyone. And so on one hand, you have a community that's saying, well, we're just trying to do the right thing. We want to use our work, our code for good. And there's a place for that, but it's not open source. The moment you put any restrictions on use, even if it's for things you don't like, you could put out open source code and it could be used by hackers that are doing ransomware. You could do open source code that is being used by militaries that you don't like. But in open source, in the world of open source, both according to the open source definition from OSI and according to Freedom Zero of the FSF, you cannot restrict use. So I want to turn the corner a little bit and talk a bit about what my organization LPI is doing about this. So LPI turned 20 in the year 2000, and we did a major bylaw change to make LPI into a membership organization. So we now have enough certified people around the world that we can say to them, we want you to be members, we want you to pick our board. And we're trying to turn LPI more into what you think of like a bar association or an engineering society or something like that, where the practitioners actually control the direction of where the profession is going. And so one of the things we've been doing with LPI is to encourage membership. And when people become members of LPI, they don't have to retake exams or do anything like that to keep their status active. We encourage professional development. So somebody teaches a course, somebody takes a course, somebody contributes open source code, somebody does advocacy to a business or government, somebody writes an article, somebody does a podcast. All of these are part of professional development. You don't see doctors and lawyers having to retake their college exams every 5 years. In the world of IT, though, to a lot of programs, if you don't retake the exam every 5 years, well, it's as if you never took it. We're not going that path. And so we're encouraging the concept of professional development. And part of that means talking about the stuff we've been talking about. It means being a good professional, contributing to it. And that also now means we did a code of conduct. And we scoured the internet. We scoured open source projects. We scoured every possible ethical group that we knew that was doing a code of conduct. We didn't find one that actually combined ethics for being in an open source community as well as ethics for being an employee or a contractor. And so we created our own. And this code of conduct is, I believe it's being made available under CC BY. So it's like a very BSD kind of license, which is what Creative Commons uses in that respect. So it started out as a part of membership, but now we require our employees, our contractors, and the people that are working with us to sign on to this. And the thing that at least bothers me the most is that we have to lay this stuff down. I'm going to go through some of the components of it. You may think they're obvious. Unfortunately, they're not. And so we've codified this. And like I say, we've done this uniquely for the world of open source, where there's entrepreneurship ethics here, as well as working in the community ethics. So there's 4 components of the code of conduct. And rather than just read out what's on the slides, you can go to it, lpi.org/conduct, and it will go into this into more detail. But essentially, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to promote open source in the world, and part of that involves having a component that says you're protecting the public interest. So you don't put malware into code as an experiment to see if the developers will find it. Which was done at a university I won't name not too long ago. And so maintaining public trust in open source is important, because especially when it doesn't have a vendor that's marketing the crap out of it, trust is really what's holding it up. Trust in quality, that the code is good quality, and also an end user, where that end user is you on your computer, or the Department of Defense, or the European Union, or whatever, can trust this for their own use. That it's trusted for the infrastructure of the internet and all these other things. Trust is an important component to this. And so that's why we put in issues such as, on a global scale, promotion of the public interest. Conflicts of interest are also a big deal. If somebody's contributing to a project and they are employed by somebody that has a specific motivation to put a certain kind of code in there. You're right, you're doing hardware drivers, and you want to make sure your company's hardware drivers are in there. Well, at least you need to disclose that to the rest of the group. Again, that's the kind of thing that you'd think would be obvious, but it's not. And so protection of public interest is basically a global scale. Demonstration of personal integrity, is an elaborate way of saying, don't be a jerk. You'd think that people would do that voluntarily. Unfortunately, it doesn't always happen. So we've codified this in here. And what it means is, when you have a codified code of conduct, it means then that you can then put together a process of what happens when somebody breaks it. And that's going to change from project to project, but at least it means you have something there. There's expectations of the people that are there. I don't think they're too onerous. I don't think most people will think they're too onerous. In fact, as I said, you might find them obvious. But at least it says, we have a code of conduct, and that means we have these expectations. If you break it, we have a process of dealing with it. This is only part of the answer. The other part is what happens if somebody goes against it, and that's going to differ from community to community. So the other two parts of this, again, you might think were obvious, but maintaining confidentiality. Somebody who has multiple clients, don't talk about one client's business to your other client, even if they're not in the same field. Abstain from gossip. You'd think that's obvious. No, it's not. And although you're working in open source, your clients are going to have trade secrets. Your employers are going to have trade secrets, and they're going to have their own proprietary stuff. And although you're an open source advocate, to be a professional at this, you've got to respect your client or your company or whatever. So if they say we're having this part open, we're having this part proprietary, as much as you can advocate for them to have more of it open, you've got to respect their decisions. And the last bit is the part that most corporate codes of conduct don't have, and that's the open source community one, and that is showing respect for colleagues and collaborators. Every project will have its own litmus test, its own sort of bar, but all I'm trying to do is get it so that in any of the open source projects in which you're involved, you're not going to have that situation where that person with the unusual name or the person with the female name is going to be treated different from any other contributor. The idea is this is supposed to be a meritocracy. You're as good as your code. And the idea is to try and keep personalities out of it, and that's how your open source is as good as it can be. And actively seek to welcome newcomers. This is going to come more easily to some than others. There's a couple of techniques that I'm going to suggest now, especially as we're making a transition from the 90s and aughts where this thing started into how do you keep a community growing and vibrant. And so to put a bit of a bow on that is just what we're trying to do with this, at least in LPI, is to elevate the profession. We want to have a level of societal respect for the people that are working in IT as much as they do in other professions, to me, like law or engineering or medicine, because if a technician doesn't do their job now, depending on where they are, really bad things can happen. It's like if an engineer doesn't do their job, a bridge falls down. If a technician doesn't do their job, a power grid goes down. There's that same level of responsibility that can be there. And so building public trust in open source, improving the community, to me, in the long run, is just going to grow the world of open source and help with the advocacy that I think all you want to engage in as well. It's basically just saying, this is a world that is trustworthy. This is a world that is this is a world whose code is worth using. And I added this sort of at the last moment. If you want to follow up on anything I'm talking about, I cannot recommend this PDF more highly. It was put out in 2008 by the Mozilla Foundation, and it's called A Framework for Purposeful Open Source. And it details about a dozen different, what they call archetypes. And the archetypes have to do with who you bring into your community, what your aims are. Is your intention of making something commercial viable, or are you just trying to muck about and do an experiment? They're both open source, but they're going to have very different ways how you license them, how you go after the people that you want in your community, and how you promote the results of your work elsewhere. They're both absolutely valid, but they have very, very different modes of operation, very different forms of corporate governance. You're now starting to see more and more open source projects become foundations, where they're doing fundraising, where they have leadership, where they have marketing, heaven forbid, where they actually have to encourage people to do documentation, because very often the coders don't want to do it. So you have all these things in mind. And that also means that The leadership also has to think of succession planning. So that is, you know, you have somebody that comes up with a great idea, and they're fearless leader to the community for a while. But then they'll get tired. They may get sick. They may decide for one reason or another, this is just too exhausting. What happens? Does the project die because they don't have fearless leader anymore? Or has there been a thought given to who's going to step up after that? Right? In the kernel, they've already started. You know, when Linus walks away, what happens? They've given that long and hard thought. And so there is a process. But that absolutely is going to be important for every single open source project that's out there, big or little, corporate or individual. They all need to deal with how that's going to happen. And that means that you want to start thinking about internal mentoring, whether or not it's formal or not, where you have the leaders that are talking to the newbies and saying, you know, get comfortable with the community, and those who want to step up have an opportunity to show their talents and show their capability to lead and to do more than just code, because you do need all of that. And I mentioned from email to Discord because you're also going to find that as this generation of open source practitioners is aging, literally, you want to bring in new blood. The colleges are all graduating people hot into open source, but they're not using email, right? They'll all eventually get accounts on Git or whatever, but when it comes to how people are talking to each other generally, you know, the standard, you know, the old mail serves, they serve their purpose, but the new generation isn't using them. And so, for instance, the Toronto Linux User Group just recently went onto Discord, and we're finding a whole bunch of new people in the audience who are using open source who wouldn't be caught dead on a mailing list. And so it's not a matter of either or. It's a matter of how you're going to evolve, how you're going to encourage the next generation to come in, because the next generation is going to be using different tech than you did. So how welcoming you are to it is going to have an effect on your sustainability as a project. And I just wanted to make one other comment about this thing about open source program officers. I had the ability to be at the open source conference in Paris 2 weeks ago. It was not a pleasant trip, thanks to COVID. But what I did find is that there is a new directive that every country in the European Union now is being required to create an open source program office. And that process is also now being followed by all of the Fortune 500 and is now starting to trickle down to SMEs. And so this is actually a new growth opportunity. This is non-technical people that are there to advise managers and HR and IT staff about advising them what licenses to use, what governance to use, what kind of projects they can, what kind of open source code they can use and which they can't, which they can trust and which they can't. This is now a thing, in that it's reality, that open source is no longer a niche. It's no longer something you have to convince most companies to use. They've decided they want to use it. Now they're all trying to figure out how. And there's a need for people in those organizations that can tell them how. And as for consolidation, no. You know, there are thousands of distributions now. There's going to be thousands of distributions in a few years. So, you know, things are still going to fork. I can still try and do what I can to reduce that, because the less forking there is, the more amount of talent there is in any given project. But this is, I think, going in a good direction. And I think it's all important to the sustainability of open source. We've come a long way in going from something that companies had to decide, do I want to use this? To now they're asking, how do I use this? And now it's up for us to step up and make that job easier for them. And on that, thank you very much. Do we have any time for QA? I don't don't have a timer on here.
We have time. If you have questions, use the mic. So we have a couple of comments online. So someone says, I fear for the Free Software Foundation not having a succession plan, even though Richard Stallman is problematic and they stick with him. I think the Free Software Foundation may fall apart when he's no longer available. That's a comment.
I'm not touching that one. I have my own views, but I keep them to myself.
That's cool.
The
I appreciate
FSF
that.
has some big challenges ahead of it, and whether or not it can maintain its own relevance is within its own hands. And I'll leave it at that.
So my view of this is that the GPL, regardless of who created it, still has power. And
the product of what the FSF and Richard Stallman did will never go away. That legacy will never go away.
Yep.
Okay? There's other baggage that's unquestionable,
Right.
but what was created and what exists can't be undone. The GPL was as great as it was, continues to be great. There still needs to be other things, like as more of the world goes in the cloud, we need to encourage more people to move to something like a Pharaoh if you're still interested in cloud-based open source, because the cloud is the way for organizations to use the GPL but still close off their code because their users are all doing it in the cloud. So there's still a challenge for the free software world that wants to maintain software freedom, and that means more use of a Pharaoh in the cloud. And that's still a fight that needs to be done, and we need organizations like the FSF to do it. Is it capable of stepping up? Like I said, that decision is in their own hands, and that's as far as I'm going on that.
Thanks, Evan. Question for the speaker: why Discord instead of an open chat system?
We went through Matrix. We went through. There's so many different ones, and we ended up making the strategic decision to go where the people were. And so that's always a difficult decision. Do you want to use this tool that is open source? Or do you want to use the tool that's got the massive installed base of people that are already there that you want to try and attract in? And so we evaluated all sorts of things. I mean, we're still using open source as much as we can. We're using Mattermost instead of Slack. We're using Big Blue Button for our meetings and so on. So yeah, we try and do it whenever we can. But in this particular case, the purpose behind going to Discord was to attract a new audience. And when that happens, you sometimes have to make a decision to go where the audience is.
I had a question. Really good talk, by the way. Really enjoyed it. I was wondering, since you implemented your code of conduct, what would you gauge its effectiveness has been, and have there been consequences for, quote, bad behavior?
The consequences are going to be different depending on the context. So for instance, within LPI, if a member exhibits egregiously bad conduct and does not account for it, there's mechanisms to either remove membership or whatever. We've never come close to having done that. We've actually found that the mere existence of the code of conduct gives people an idea of what their target is. And unfortunately, you have to say, don't be a jerk to get people not to be a jerk. But sometimes merely having merely that statement that's saying this matters to us actually is effective far more than you might expect.
I had another question. Okay, I'll do one more. I'm a little concerned. You look at the age. If you do an average age of everybody in here, you get a little concerned about the young folks and membership and succession. So I'm wondering, have you seen an uptick in 20 and 30-year-olds in your organization? Are you concerned, like I am a bit, that we might be, there's no generation to pick up the ball?
That's why I'm giving this talk. I mean, I want to try and raise the alarm that succession planning is a thing that open source projects need to concern themselves about. That assuming that the people that founded it in the first place are not going to be there forever and having to deal with that reality is something that projects large and small are going to have to deal with. And I guess that's the point behind me being up here, is to try and note that, you know, the tech skills aren't enough. There are people that need to step up in leadership, and sometimes that could be leadership by committee. You don't need to have, you know, a charismatic person at the top. You can have a leadership by committee. It doesn't have the same sex appeal, but it can work just as effectively, especially when you have a situation where you have a lot of large companies that have agreed to do an open source infrastructure project on which they all build their own things. In that case, leadership by committee will suit everyone. And I would point back to that Mozilla document again as giving in numerous examples of different ways to do an open source project, and they'll have wildly different ways of doing governance, of doing their boards, of doing leadership. And it might just be a charismatic person at the top, and that thing might just, you know, explode into something great and then fizzle out just as fast, and maybe that was what was intended as an experiment. That's still legitimate use of these techniques and these licenses. You know, there's lots of stuff you just toss over the wall, and maybe people will pick up on them, and maybe they won't. And that happens too. And that's totally legitimate. That encourages innovation. You may toss 3 things over the wall, and only, you know, the 4th one gets taken up by anyone. That happens. That's the way it works. To me, that's a good thing. But it also means that there's a lot of different ways to handle this. So that's why I wanted to call attention to that Mozilla document. And if you missed it on the slideshow, just do a search for Mozilla open source archetypes, and it'll point you to that. It's a PDF.
Thank you.
Alrighty then, I guess that's it. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of the conference.